thing that you raised at the end, whether Gérard Cordemois is Cartesian or not. There is, if I recall, in Malebranche, Recherche de la Vérité, and Book 1, a direct reference to Cordemois. If I'm not mistaken, he actually sees him as, because of the way he talks about him and what he focuses on in Cordemois, he sees him as a Cartesian. Is that really not the case? That's my question.
So
sorry, go ahead.
I didn't mean to imply that Cordemois is not a Cartesian. I think it's undoubtedly the case that he is a Cartesian. That is, in the sense that he accepts a number of Descartes' views. He agrees, so most especially Cartesian dualism, also his mechanistic project. And Cordemois' Six Discourses is, in some important respects, modeled on Descartes' project in the Meditations. So by those criteria, I'd say he counts as a Cartesian. He's, what I did say at the very end, and I might have said it very quickly and therefore not been clear enough about it, but what makes Cordemois a little bit different from other Cartesians, what makes him actually unique among the Cartesians, or almost unique among the Cartesians, is that he is an atomist. Right? Descartes argues that there are no physical atoms, that body is infinitely divisible. Cordemois says that body is, that big-sized objects or medium-sized objects, these sorts of things are divisible. He calls that matter, but what he calls bodies, he reserves that term for corporeal physical atoms that are indivisible and that are the only corporeal or material substances on his view. In that regard, his view is more like that of Gassendi, the sort of preeminent early modern atomist, at least in the first half of the 17th century. In that regard, his views are different from Descartes, and I think that's significant because it shows that this isn't so clear in the case of some of these other early Cartesian occasionalists, but it shows that Cordemois, I think it shows that Cordemois isn't accepting occasionalism just because he accepts Descartes' views and thinks it's a logical implication. If he thought that, I think that what I tried to argue is it would be possible for someone, even a person in the 17th century, to say, well, wait, I don't like this conclusion. One of these premises from Descartes must be wrong. And the fact that he's an atomist, I think, is evidence that he's willing to revise Descartes' views or willing to reject parts of Descartes' views if he doesn't like them, if he doesn't think they're the right view. So I think that's significant, but I don't think that it shows that he's not a Cartesian.
So, could I comment? So I think that's the case for all the later Cartesians. That is, I can't think of an instance where down the line, every single view of Descartes is accepted by successors. That there's always modification going on. This is pretty dramatic in Cordemois' case, but in Malebranche, of course, all these figures, they were adapting Descartes' views rather than just taking them home.
And I had a comment, is that okay?
Sure.
Professor Paul? For whatever it's worth, Alain de Libérat, in his Archéologie du Sujet, deals with this issue of what, I don't know, could be termed as sort of Descartes' dithering, or I don't know what to call it. And it has something to do with perhaps something that we haven't talked about very much here, but it's the sort of tortured history or trajectory of the history of the human subject, or the emergence of the human subject. Because the human subject emerges out of through using a language that is sort of inadequate for it, because initially the subject is the subjectum is what we would call actually an object. It's sort of a passive entity, and through something that is passive, the later thinkers are trying to account for human agency in the human subject, and so there you have this sort of kind of tension of language that is also inadequate to sort of account for these things. So that's a direction, this question of this subject that Alain de Libera suggests as an explanation to this dithering.
Thanks.
D'accord.
I'm not familiar with that source.
Dr. Schmaltz, when you talked about Berkeley's and how Berkeley deals with the problem of evil, can you also talk about how he deals with the problem of free will?
So this has to do with his limitation of Malebranche's occasionalism. So he holds that spirits are genuinely active. And I guess he has a view of divine concurrence, right?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm looking at the person who wrote on this. I haven't really studied this aspect of Berkeley much, but so he does have the view that God acts with us in a sense, but not in an occasionalist manner. So God acts, but we also act, and we are sort of the responsible party in our actions. So, and actually this is a little like Malebranche's solution to the problem of moral evil. We're free, and God doesn't determine us. Berkeley has something like that in a more concurrentist thing, that it's up to us, and God just permits us to go wrong. Although Berkeley thinks in our case we can really create things. We can create ideas. So we do have creative power with the help of God's concurrence, and that's the limitation to the occasional.
Yeah. Do you think it is reconcilable with his idealism? Or do you think he is an idealist?
I'm not sure it works in the end. I don't know whether we disagree on that. I'm skeptical that he can make out a genuine sense in which we have control over our own body, for instance. He might be able to say in imagination we can create ideas, but in the case of our own body, where it affects not only us but all other perceivers, and God has to be involved, I'm not sure it works. That's my sense.
I think it's consistent with his idealism, and there's just a question of how far out he needs to push it. So it could be the case that he thinks you can imagine, say, a pink elephant, and since that won't interact with any other minds, it doesn't look like that's a real problem.
Yeah.
There's famous passage where he says we move our legs ourselves. That sort of starts making it look like it's bodily agency, but bodily agency is much more complicated. I think probably it's technically consistent with concurrence, and even about bodily agency is probably technically consistent with his idealism, but I think he's got that less worked out. But there's always the sort of limit case that does look like non-occasionalism is consistent with idealism.
But that's not really, so when he addresses the problem of evil, it's not with respect to that case where we can imagine. It's with respect to we can move our bodies. We have control over what our bodies
Well, or conversely, you could have a non-occasionalist with respect to the will, and then God takes over from there.
Yeah.
And I take it all the worries about evil will be taken care of at the level of, it's that we will, I will to hit my neighbor or something like that. That's the problem. So I think you can always make it consistent. That's my guess.
Yeah, maybe in theory, but in practice, when Bartlett talks about this problem, he says, what gets me out of this is the fact that I do have this power over my body. I'm looking at the principles at one point, he says that. I can control the actions of my body, where it doesn't seem limited to just what's in the will. And insofar as he thinks that's the solution, I think he's in trouble.
Yeah.
But if he could draw back and say, no, I have control over my own will, and God, that serves as the occasion for God, maybe he should do that. But that's not the view he suggests.
I think I'm okay with the more ambitious thing, but I think he could also just understand that to be shorthand for I control my body could mean God lets me, when I will, when my legs move, God moves my legs. And so that'll be the cheaper answer. Hey, I'm not even on the pan.
Yeah, I have a related question to this. I think you said at one point toward the end, and maybe this was for both thinkers or just for Berkeley, that moral obligation comes from divine will. That is, he wants us to do certain things.
That's for both, right?
Okay, that's what I thought. And so I'm wondering then, how do they deal with disobedience? And because I'm wondering, like, at least in the Islamic conception, like God's will, and I think I addressed this at the end of my presentation, when he wills something, that that should happen. And if it doesn't happen, it means that something is more powerful than God and it's intervening. So if we see moral obligation as God's will, how do we make sense of the fact that we don't always do the things he wants us to do?
Probably in terms of antecedent consequent will, something like that. God wishes it were the case that.
Okay.
But of course, everything that happens, God allows or permits to happen. In that sense, wills it.
Okay, so it's kind of a different sense of will in that regard?
Yeah, I think so. I don't, thinking so, I think you find this more in Malebranche, the difference between sort of an antecedent willing that something, would that it were the case that this would happen, but it doesn't have practical bite. It's only as consequent will that has the practical bite. I guess I'm attributing the same sort of distinction to Berkeley, but I have less confidence it's there in the texts.
I'm struck by the argument that we can't actually be the creators of the movement in our hands because we're not aware of the details of what's going on. I'm struck this is a standard Ash'ari argument. It's one of those that keeps recurring. There are others that are shifting, but this is, and I was just wondering, do we know if Malebranche is the first to advance this argument, or is he picking it up from somewhere?
I've always assumed he's picking it up from a line in Descartes that probably didn't mean, that Descartes did not mean himself to mean what Malebranche thought he meant with it. I could even find it if I had my papers more in order. I don't think I do. Yeah, it's,
Is it on the worksheet?
no, it's actually a quote from Descartes himself that where he takes it. It's certainly, yeah, here's the quote. It's from a letter to Regis. Descartes had written, quote, "We cannot will anything without understanding what we will." That doesn't seem to be the way Malebranche is reading it. But, so I think it's a questionable use, if that's Malebranche's source. It's a questionable use of saying, oh, and I get this from Descartes. To know, why should it be that I need to know down to the last finest detail how the effect is brought about in order to bring that out? We need to know what we're willing, right? But the specifics of, I think that's what Descartes' line to Regis is, we need to know what we're willing if we're willing it. And otherwise it's just something like shivering, for example, something we're just doing, but not an activity. So I think that's where Malebranche gets it, but I don't think it's what Descartes meant.
Well, so there is an antecedent in Arnold Hulick's for that argument, and I don't know.
Was that published after the?
Yeah, it was.
In the 60s.
Published posthumously in the 90s. Is that right? I can't remember.
Yeah, 90.
Yeah. So, but it had to have dated to the 50s or 60s because he died in 1664. But Arnold Hulick gives that same argument. It wasn't published until after Malebranche published his Search After Truth, so it's unlikely that he would have gotten the argument from Hulick's, but it was clearly around. Also, Glanville gives an argument, like who was the person that I didn't get to talk about, but also gives a similar argument. So that argument was definitely around. Where they were all getting it and how the lines of influence related to one another, I think is a tricky question.
I should mention, so I heard Emanuele Scribano, Italian philosopher, historian of philosophy, give a really excellent paper, and I wish I remember the details, but she traced this back to Galen and through Campanella into the modern period. So it might have really ancient sources. Something about physiological functioning. I forget I wish I remember the details of the argument, and I'll ask her for the paper, but it did trace this. You have to, in order to produce something, you have to know how to produce it, back to this medical tradition.
Anyway, suppose a complex question, in terms of reception and dissemination of these, ideas. Any of the panelists could address how these ideas were, discussed beyond Malebranche and Berkeley at their time, and do we have anything more about dissemination and reception of these ideas?
So I can say, in my case, my paper, this is an outtake from a paper on Malebranche, Berkeley, and Hume. So I trace it into Hume. The sort of influence of this point about generality I see is passing through the Malebranche and Berkeley to Hume, and generality with regard to nature as picking up on a Malebranchian point. And then even with respect to the moral sphere, Hume's discussion of property, of justice, rules of justice, has connections to what you see in Berkeley. So that's the farthest I've traced it.
Just to add to that, there's a translation of Malebranche's Section-2 from the early 1700s that he apparently got a hold of by this guy, Thomas Taylor, and Charles McCracken has a really interesting book, Malebranche in British Philosophy, where he traces the translation in Taylor to some of Hume's texts, and they're, in some cases, they're what we today would, I think of as plagiarism.
Actually, a follow-up question related to these ideas, how they disseminate. I just wonder about the social cultural impact of those ideas in maybe both academic circles or in the public sphere, because we know that Malebranche was also a priest. He belonged to the oratory, so that must be some kind of public interest in disseminating maybe these ideas. I don't know. Do you know anything about that?
The only thing, so I'm not sure what to say about Malebranche. In Berkeley's case, the passive obedience was definitely born of a particular political struggle. And he was insisting on general rules and morality as an argument against rebellion against the English crown. So that had a concrete political motivation. In Malebranche's case, I don't see a similar sort of motivation for these views. I mean, a social or political sort of motivation.
And its impact on people? How?
Well, some of the early occasionalists, they were writing. I mean, it's the case for all of these guys that they were writing works that were intended for for a literate audience, anyone who could read them. And in the case of the early occasionalists, they represent a little bit of the constituency for Cartesian ideas. So Courtois was a lawyer and a jurist, and Laforge was a doctor. Right? So these weren't academics in the modern sense. Though Cartesianism had a kind of popular audience. I mean, I wouldn't call it. I don't think it's accurate to say that it's like I don't really describe it as having a popular effect or anything like that. But
There was a tradition, right, with the early Cartesians of the weekly salons, the Macrodes Rouleau, so they were meeting in social settings on a regular basis. I assume they called them Macrodes because they met every Wednesday to discuss.
I think Monsieur Fred, you mentioned Malebranche might have had some theological reasons to assert his official doctrines. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I wrote a paper on it years ago, so I'm trying to call some of it back. I've always, since I first read Malebranche, seen whether it was the vision in God, so I like connecting up the vision in God with the occasionalism. Malebranche consistently pursuing that avenue that would usually lead to taking away from humans so as to attribute to God. A theological motive in those particular areas. As I had in the handout, he gives explicit philosophical arguments for occasionalism.
Yeah.
But I've just always read him, and maybe this doesn't go much past just sort of gut reaction when I first read him. But there was that theological motivation that any move I can make that does more to glorify God by giving more power to God. And I think, again, when he goes through what are known as the elimination arguments,
thinks of five places our ideas could come from, and he knocks them off until he gets to the vision of God as the only one left. For many of those, if not all the other four, his reason for rejecting them has to do with the word finite creatures. We could never do that. It must be God.
Does this have anything to do with his asceticism? Anything with, does this have anything to do with his asceticism as a mystic? I think he has that side as well, right? Malabaraj as a mystic.
That I could not speak to.
I don't think so.
Did he practice anything related to Christianity?
The oratorians weren't as rigorous as some of the other orders. So it's mainly a teaching order. So you didn't find vows of silence and wearing of hair shirts and things like that among the oratorians. So I guess I don't think of him as an ascetic.
I think I remember reading in Etienne de Gilson about that aspect of his. That's why he Gilson argues that he moved towards that direction. I mean, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know whether I agree with you on that.
I think Gilson refers to some more of an intellectual mysticism rather than asceticism or practice. So some of the
Something like that.
yeah, but not in terms of
what does intellectual asceticism mean? I know what regular old asceticism means, but I'm not sure what intellectual is.
That's what Gilson.
I mean, with respect to the question about sort of socio-political motivations, so in Malebranche's case, there was this concern to bring together Augustine and Descartes, and that was part of a promotion of Descartes, the Cartesianism against critics saying is anti-religious. So he did have some strategic reasons. I mean, I think he genuinely thought they go together or can be united in the way he thought, but it also had a practical benefit of defending Descartes against a certain line of theological criticism that his views out of line with the beliefs of the Catholic Church in particular.
I'm just curious, so when someone like Suarez is attacking occasionalism, who is he thinking of? And when Malebranche and the other quote-unquote Cartesians are advocating occasionalism, is there any textual evidence that they're aware that occasionalism is in vogue on the other side of the Atlantic, or is there no indication that they're at all aware of this or concerned about this at all?
Well, the first part of the question, Suarez had probably two people in mind, both of whom Malebranche cites as allies, as medieval allies in occasionalism, and I'm pretty sure neither one of them were actually occasionalists. Gabriel Biel and Peter Dailly were the people Malebranche cites, and I'm guessing Suarez probably had them. They were sort of labeled as occasionalists, but I think both of them just aren't. I have a paper on Biel where I argue that he's not, and there's one on Dailly to the same effect. I don't know with the Cartesians in particular, Corduroy, I don't think he was aware of. I think it all springs from what they saw to be Cartesian commitments, and I don't know that they studied beyond that.
Well, so the earlier guys, it's hard to tell what sources they might be drawing on because they're very similar to Descartes in that they present their arguments as though they're just bringing up from reason alone, and no one else has ever said this before. So Malebranche is actually a little bit better about citing other sources. So it's very hard to tell. It seems unlikely that they would not have been. So occasionalism is discussed in Suarez. It's also discussed in Thomas Aquinas, only to be dismissed by them. It seems unlikely that they would have been totally unaware of that background. But on the other hand, it's hard to tell to what extent they were aware of the earlier Islamic.
Just in addition to this point, Malebranche actually refers to Averroes, and probably here he might have read the incoherence of the incoherence and get some familiarity with Al-Ghazali's ideas and arguments, because there were some Latin translations of that work. Also, he refers to Maimonides, and Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed has a chapter on calamatomism, in which he summarizes the calamatomism in 12 propositions. So that might be another source that he can get some familiarity with, but not in detail. And given that, it's likely that they know that there is a kind of occasionalist system, but they work the details within the Cartesian framework, because Descartes already had proposed some philosophical system, and from which they tried to develop this idea of occasionalism. And St. Augustine might be another influential motivation here.
I just want to specify, I'm not trying to say that they're borrowing, or not even in the medieval period, just across the Mediterranean, in their own time, occasionalism was orthodoxy. So it's just, were they at all aware of that? But it seems maybe not.
I would doubt it.
Yeah, okay.
But they would have known about Aquinas' attack on the Moors, in which Suarez was picking up to, makes references to. So they knew that there was a Moorish view of occasionalism. But I don't think they saw themselves as taking that over.
Actually, I would like to extend your discussion from Malebranche, Berkeley, and you said Hume.
Yes.
So when we follow that pattern of generalizations, so Malebranche talks about that those general laws of evolutions, and for God's purposes, then Berkeley shift the direction to human purposes, and when we come to Hume, there is no God at all. So
the story is he splits the difference with respect to nature and morality. So with respect to nature, they're not for you. Nature doesn't care about you. So he has this essay of suicide where he says, according to nature, your life is no more valuable than that of an oyster. Nature doesn't care about you. So the generalities of the law aren't for your sake at all. That I see is closer to a Malebranchian sort of line, where it's not for our benefit. But with respect to justice, rules of justice, there it is a very utilitarian sort of view that these are for our own benefit, although they're rooted not in the divine will, but our own sentiments. Right? That those are going to be the source for those rules having normative force. So there I see him as closer to Berkeley than to Malebranche.
But if we follow the timeline, we see that the shift is from God to humans.
Yes.
And when we come to Hume, there is no God at all. And
Yeah.
I mean, in his system, there is no God.
Right. God isn't grounding anything.
So why do you think there is such a gradual change and ultimately finalized with Hume's, eliminating God from the system?
That's sort of like the question, why do we get the change from Malebranche to Berkeley that we do? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, and if I don't have the answer to that, I probably don't have the answer to why, when we get to Hume, does the God stuff drop out? I mean, one could appeal to sort of Enlightenment attitudes taking root as you get later into the 18th century. So as you go from Bishop Berkeley to Hume, you get more of a skepticism, empiricist sort of skepticism about the warrant for religious claims. I think Hume is part of that sort of line of skepticism. But what I find interesting is, even despite this obviously very big difference, you find echoes of Malebranche and echoes of Berkeley in Hume, where he naturalizes it, but you still get the same appeals to generality. And And the same comparison in talking about moral laws to, well, laws of nature are general and have bad effects, that, you know, that we have to take that. And we have to take the bad effects because generality is better overall. And that sort of strategy you find in Berkeley. And I think Hume takes that over in an interesting way. Even though the grounds are totally different now. It's not God's will. God's will has nothing to do with it. It's our sentiments that are doing the grounding.
I think there's a question for all of you. Now, what do you think of occasionalism today? You know, can it be a promising framework to explain, or you know, how do you see it? I mean, can you relate that? I mean, is it just a medieval throwback or whatever? You know, is it something relevant today? What do you think? Difficult question.
Well, so I'd say insofar as Hume's relevant for contemporary philosophy of science and contemporary views of scientific laws, occasionalism is still relevant because a lot of the foundation for the Humean arguments there are drawn from occasionalism, quite self-consciously so. And I think there is a strong Humean strain to contemporary views in philosophy of science. To that extent, occasionalism is still alive. It's an occasionalism without God, but it's nonetheless, we get to that point through occasionalism, I think, to this contemporary Humean. So I guess that's where I would see the most dramatic sort of upshot of occasionalism.
Certainly to the degree that the early occasionalists were motivated by their adoption of Cartesian physics, to the degree Cartesian physics then was a failure, occasionalism, then if that was your motivation, was Cartesian physics, once that's no longer, Cartesian physics is no longer an option for you, then occasionalism would no longer be as relevant.
But the case of Hume shows it wasn't tied to Cartesian physics.
Right.
And that,
No,
that you could be detached from it and
Right.
have it in separate sort of influence.
And do you mean, in the context of modern science, say quantum physics, possibilities, things that there may have problems?
Oh, I couldn't speak to that. I'm not considered that. A lot of, you're right, Ted's correct. I was limited to just those people like Gordon Moy and LaForge and Berlings and the others who came to their occasionalism because of the path they saw Cartesian physics taking. If that was their motivation, or anyone's motivation, once Cartesian physics was failing, occasionalism no longer jumps out as an attractive option to solve the problem.
But I think what's interesting is certain views of science. So I mentioned Hume. One could also mention Berkeley's instrumentalism as having successors, non-theological successors in the contemporary period with respect to quantum mechanics. I'm thinking about von Frossen here. So you find sort of upshots of occasionalism that become detached from the theological stuff, but you still see remnants of it in contemporary views of science. I don't know if anyone, well, among philosophers of science, it's not going to be popular to say, the laws are due to God's recreating the world from moment to moment. I don't think you're going to find a groundswell of support for that sort of view. But what you find are certain views that historically were originally derived from or founded on theological occasionalism. It's just the theological stuff is dropped out.
I have a question for you, but this two ideas that you draw. One is this idea that God does that for our own, for His own benefit or for our own benefit. And I wanted to ask you which one you think is more prone for practical ethic. And the reason why I'm asking this because I'm on the Islamic tradition that I feel this resonates with the Mu'tazili and the Ash'arites. So the Mu'tazili idea of God's justice. And Ghazali attacked the Mu'tazilites for telling them that this idea of evil and good and evil, the idea of justice, because they wanted to kind of detach evil from God. So this
this is one of his arguments against their rational ethic, as a lot of the modern scholarship deals with. For him, it's the ada, the habitual, the divine habit is actually for our own benefit. But then you're stuck in the again the argument is against Ghazali and again in the modern scholarship is that we're in an occasionalist worldview where we cannot, it doesn't, where we do, God commands us to do things and there's no rational explanation for that. So.
Yeah, so you don't find that kind of radical voluntarism in any of these figures that I've been looking at. So they all have, there's a rational basis to our morality, that God doesn't will without regard to what the intellect says is morally, the moral rules are. So you don't get the full-blown voluntarism here that you get in some other traditions. What they take over is the view that, well, divine will has to be there for these laws to have any normative force. But God has to have good reasons for willing what he wills on this view. And the question is whether it's for himself, his own benefit, or your benefit. And I think Malebranche has the hard line here. But one can see how if you take that line, he has an easier time with the problem of evil than those who say, no, God, acts just for our concern. And then it is mysterious. So why all these evils? Why doesn't he intervene more? Yeah, and I think on that point, Berkeley has a weaker argument, weaker response to the problem. Now, it's a hard bullet to bite because it gives a very sort of stern view of God as, self-centered, loving himself, not caring, in a way it seems, not caring about the effects on you, puny creatures. And he tries to moderate that somewhat, but I think that still that hardcore is there, that's the motivation. It's love of himself. And you don't ultimately matter relative to that consideration. That's something Berkeley couldn't buy. And I think it's because of changing in attitudes about God being conceived as loving and compassionate and things like that. That seemed in tension with the Malebranchian line, I think, seemed in tension with the desire to see God as compassionate in that way. I don't know whether but so you don't get, in this period, well, in these figures, you don't get the full-blown, it's just because God wills it, that it's obligatory. It has to have a rational basis, but for it to have normative force, it has to have a rational basis plus God's commandment of us that we follow his rules. And then the only question is, why does God command us to do that?
So I was going to ask, why these two ideas can be the same thing but described in different way. For example, the Lucy says there is an artist. He tried to express his art attributes, and he's cutting the dress. At the end of the day, he shows his passion, but at the same time he's making like the nice dress, and we get benefit of having like good looking. He's combining these two together. Why these two people they try to separate from each other? Why? Because the God will, whatever he tried to actually express is going to be through us at the end of the day, because we are created by him. Whatever his will, we are going to be in that will. We cannot separate the creation that has doing its own purposes, but there is a God in other place doing its own purposes. I mean, why do they make this distinction?
Yeah, so I think the question is, what's the ultimate basis? So I think Malebranche even says, God can be motivated to act in a way because it perfects his creatures, that can serve as a motivation, but it only serves as a motivation insofar as perfecting creatures perfects himself. So the question is, what's at the root of God's willing these things? And in Malebranche's case, it is going to be God's necessary love for himself that's providing the motivation in all these cases. Whereas in Berkeley's case, that seems too harsh, seems to make God too distant in a way from us. And I think we have a sort of, well, I said anthropocentric or utilitarian turn there, and saying that no, of course, God's willing that we be perfected perfects him, but his perfecting himself no longer is the root motivation. It's perfecting us. That's the motivation for the actions. So they're both there in a sense, in both thinkers, and the question is just which has priority, which is the ultimate motivation, and they differ on that question.
Yeah, please read, you get the third option available on the table, which you get gestured at in the fourth meditation, but in Leibniz. So you have no falling through the cracks. Right? Malebranche, you get these general laws that it's good on the whole, like that they're there, but every now and then you get the rain on the ocean, or these are monstrous children. Leibniz just don't have it. You just don't recognize it's not evil.
Is that true? on Malebranche's view, it is evil.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But it's a falling through the cracks, right? Whereas with Leibniz, no, you're missing it. It looks like evil to you, but in the grand scheme of things, it's probably the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah,
I was just throwing that as a third option.
Yeah, I wonder how deep the difference is between. So I've written on this. What is the difference here exactly between Leibniz and Malebranche? And I think the differences are less stark than we make here. That is that one, Leibniz is not denying it's evil; he's allowing it's evil, and evil required for the best of all possible order, but still an evil. And he also, and this is in line with Malebranche, he doesn't want to say, especially in the case of moral evil, that God positively wills it, even though it's part of the best possible world. He says that God permits it in a way that's sort of Malebranchian. So in those respects, I think they're pretty close. I think the differences is that Malebranche doesn't think that God has to will the best of all possible worlds. He doesn't have a principle of sufficient reason. It's only God's love of his perfection that's the driving force here. So, but I don't think I'm not sure there's a clear third option with respect to this.
Couldn't there be one if you construed Leibnizian monads as responsible for their own perceptual and appetitive states throughout all of, this would be a pretty strange view, right? But at times it looks as if the monad is itself responsible for any state it undergoes, and so there's a weird way in which there wouldn't be everything would be the monad's own fault, essentially.
But that's not Leibniz's view, right?
Well, maybe in 17.
Really? So I would think the view is that the monad is responsible for things that rose voluntarily, which can occur only in minds capable of rational deliberation, and then you get a sort of compatibilist view, right? Even though it's completely determined by what's in the monad, still you wanted to do it, and you deliberated about it, so you're responsible for it.
Here's a thought on the first step towards the third position.
Okay.
You might think what Berkeley and Malebranche agree on is that there's a trade-off between order and particular goods, right? So that on your story, right, God wants there to be big regularities, and that comes at the cost of doing some things that would be nice in the particular. And then you've got two different stories about why God cares about the regularity, right? So for Malebranche, it's the regularity itself bespeaks God's glory, and Berkeley, the regularity is useful for us. Leibniz, you might think, is a bit more of an optimist, right? So this you might think this is distinctive of Leibniz. He thinks the regularity, there is no trade-off, right? He thinks that really the regularity that you got, you couldn't replace any it's not at there's no trade-off, right? He thinks that the order is also gets you the best particulars, there's no, it's not, right, so on the common to Malebranche and Barclay, you've got a trade-off. You could have better particulars at the expense of regularity, but for Leibniz, he's pretty clear. Part of his optimism is he thinks the regularity allows you the most best particulars.
Although not taken just in themselves, only when you take them as part of the whole order, right? So
well, but it's not that's true, but right, so on the other two pictures, right, you might think, here's another possible world. It's got less order but better particulars, right? Whereas Leibniz thinks there is no other world that's got better particulars in it at the cost of less order. He thinks the order is maximized as well as the particulars are maximized. And so, and you might think that's crazy, but that's the Leibnizian optimism. But it does seem like that's the start on a third position, because it's giving up the common assumption of both Barclay and Malebranche.
Of the trade-off.
Of the trade-off, which makes sense because, prima facie that's the way it looks, and maybe that's what you were starting to hint at, right? Or maybe that's what you were saying. Prima facie, it looks like the rain falling on the ocean's, a lesser particular, but Leibniz thinks that's only prima facie.
Although, yeah, that's a good suggestion. I mean, so when Leibniz comments on Malebranche's view, he doesn't emphasize problems with the trade-offs. He emphasizes, well, but I'm just considering the work and the ways put together, and you're separating them out, which I don't think tells against the trade-offs view, but something about, well, what's supposed to be motivating here is greatest perfection overall, ways and product put together. And I'm not sure that's quite the difference that you're pointing to. So I think that would allow more for, well, you could have more complicated laws and better individuals, but that would give you less than the best of all possible worlds. So that would be the trade-off. If you had anything different, you'd have a less than best possible world, and that would provide reasons. And so I'm not sure that's quite the difference that you're pointing to.
Yeah. So I think, as you know, right? Leibniz sometimes he's not. I think Leibniz's considered position is there is no trade-off. I think sometimes he thinks he can engage Malebranche anyway because he's got other axes to grind.
Right.
And so he'll talk with him. But I think Leibniz's considered position is there is no trade-off. And then you might think that's different from both Malebranche and Barclay, where they do seem to think there's a particular general trade-off.
It might be there's no trade-off just in the sense that if you change any of them, you'll get a less than best possible.
But you'll get less order too. That's the trick, right? If you change any of the particulars, you also get less order. Whereas it looks like Malebranche and Barclay think you could trade some of the particulars, you can get more order.
Yeah, it might be that there are different notions of order in the two. Because order just be for Malebranche in terms of the generality of the laws, where that's not what Leibniz has in mind. Right? If you're talking about the general order, where the general laws will be subsidiary to that, there might be a shifting in the notion of what counts as order. So
the order that God esteems. But
that's the sort of
the
general order that comprehends
the order that
everything.
makes the world good.
Yeah, but right. But I think the general order there is going to be just everything taken together, and so I'm not sure that that's different from God wanting to create the best possible world.
I feel like I've already talked too long.
Yeah. So let's have this little fight.
Yeah, we'll fight it. Another. Yeah, what?
Is it time for?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But I'm not sure whether this is a problem in the phrasing, but certainly I think in the Islamic tradition there was the mainstream. There was no really a willingness to say that God creates something for his own sake. Some theologians might want to say he creates things for our sake. With the possible exception of Ibn Arabi, and I'm not clear, but no exoteric theologian was prepared to say that God benefits or becomes more glorious because he's already perfect. So I was wondering if this is not a worry in this context, or it's a matter of the phrasing.
Yes, so that's part of the So Malebranche holds that God is not obliged by his love of himself to create. So it isn't as if his creating makes him more glorious. So there he agrees. He does think, though, that having decided freely to create, God must create in the way that most reflects his perfection. And that's where the general volition is done. So, but I don't think that's said in a way that says that God needs to create to perfect himself. I mean, Malebranche would deny that. I'm not sure about Berkeley, but Malebranche for sure would deny that. But it's just that having decided without constraint to create, he has to create in the way that best reflects himself in the world. Is that in line with the sort of theological tradition?
Well, certainly in line with what some Islamic theological schools would say.
Ibn Arabi wants to reconcile the two, actually, necessity and free will in God.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he says God cannot not create because God is infinite, what I was talking about. And on the other hand, he says God cannot not be God because it is God's nature to be, to create. By complying his nature, he's being free. On the one hand, necessity because God, but only in God you can imagine necessity and free will dissolves into compatibility. Nowhere else.
Yeah. For Malebranche, it's heretical. It's heretical to say that, it's an emanationist view that he would have rejected on the grounds that God freely creates in such a way he could have not created and remained just as perfect. So, yeah, so he wants to resist a sort of Neoplatonic view of emanation, the good diffusing itself naturally.
Yeah.
Say no, will has to intervene there, and there has to be a free will in a pretty strong sense that God can do it.
Well, should we thank our panel?
Okay, we have 15-minute break and then we'll come for